Thank you for joining us. I'm Pamela Harris Lawton, the Florence Gaskins Harper Endowed Chair in Art Education in the Hurwitz Center at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And I will start with a land acknowledgement. Please join me. We acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Piscataway and the Susquehanna tribes that Indigenous people have lived here since the 10th millennium BC and have been joined through the northern migration by the Lumbee and the Cherokee in this region we now call Baltimore. We also acknowledge the people enslaved and exploited who did and do work on this land, enabling us to live, and Mother Earth, from which all life springs. Here at MICA, we strive to honor the ancestors and to work equitably and honorably towards social justice with their descendants. The Hurwitz Center, named for distinguished scholar and practitioner Dr. Al Hurwitz, continues MICA's 100-year legacy of excellence in leadership and art education. The mission and goals of the Hurwitz Center are to advance MICA's long commitment to art and design education and field-based social practice, cultivate a network of community-based practitioners, educators, scholars, empowered to promote innovative pedagogy and research through engagement with art and design, and to catalyze dialogue and inspire action through collaborative partnerships, events, projects, and publications that serve Baltimore, the state of Maryland, the nation, and beyond. Welcome to the 2022 Visiting Voices Speaker Series, an annual event hosted by the Hurwitz Center. This year's topic is Black Women Artist Educators on Anti-Racist Art Education. We have 5 fabulous Black women artist educators scholars with us this evening to discuss the challenges and opportunities for Black women teaching about race and arts education with learners and audiences across the lifespan in a variety of educational settings. Issues, strategies, and resources will be presented, followed by a questions and answers period. Our first panelist is Mama Rashida Foreman-Bay, a director, actress, teaching artist, community activist, songwriter, storybook author, and Master Virtues Project facilitator. She is one of the founding artistic directors of Wombwork Productions, a Baltimore-based 501c3 social change theater company. For over 25 years, Wombwork's community programs and performances have served to enrich local neighborhoods, confronting relevant social issues endemic throughout the world, such as gun violence, domestic abuse, grief, drug, alcohol abuse, gang violence, HIV prevention, sexual assault, health disparities, and racial inequities. Utilizing the performing arts as a tool for transformation, Mama Rashida has been committed to helping youth and their families reach their full potential. Welcome, Mama Rashida.
Thank you, welcome. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. No, no, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Thank you to Sweet Honey in the Rock. Listen, everybody. Greetings, greetings, greetings. As a child of the Black Power and Black Arts movement, I began studying culture and history of my people from Africa, the birthplace of humanity, to ancestral freedom fighters like Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer, and African diaspora freedom fighters like Toussaint Louverture and Nanny of the Maroons. I'm a lifelong learner, and I'm a native of Baltimore. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Baltimore today. Like most other cities in the US, the historical and racism and disparities that exist in Baltimore have affected my community deeply. From the unjust judicial system, where Black people are imprisoned at a rate 5 times that of whites, the unequal educational system filled with curriculums that share lies and half-truths and continue to tell the story of history, the history of humanity from the lens of European colonizers, both supporting the school to prison pipeline. And you add on police brutality, unfair housing practices, viewing abandoned buildings every day, drug addiction, poverty, unemployment, all the things that Black people have been fighting for since the Jim Crow era. This is institutional racism at its worst. Our organization, Woundwork Productions, was really started as a direct response to institutional racism. We're a social justice theater company. Our mission is to empower youth and families and to preserve cultural legacies through the performing arts. Now, when working in schools, because we work in schools all over the state of Maryland, what we found, particularly in 1997, when we first started, that Black people were still struggling to believe in their beauty and battling with self-love. We said, how can we counteract this? So our response to dealing with institutional racism and working with young people was, you know, how can we help young people to love themselves, you know? How deep do we love ourselves can determine our level of success. First, we started with the basics. We go into schools and communities with tools, right, that help these young people to make a deep connection to their culture. The arts is a powerful tool, right, to be able to help people to be able to know something about themselves, right? We started sharing storybooks with images that children were able to relate to. We share the history of our own people from their own perspective. And once young people know their history, all right, and they hear those victory stories, and they begin to paint brown faces and experience the beautiful rituals and culture that support a sense of belonging, that will equip them with the power to drastically change their trajectory. They're able to envision a world of infinite possibilities. They're able to see the beauty in others because they see the beauty in themselves. They're able to love others because they truly love themselves. And because of this understanding of who they are, they begin to love and respect who they see in the mirror. So we say to artists, and I've been training other teaching artists, if you're an artist working in an African-American, Latino, or Indigenous community, you have to care about that community. You have to know the history of the people of that community who've been marginalized by the dominant society. You have to know what the grandmothers in that community care about. You have to know what's important to them. You have to know that there's wisdom in that community and respect and honor it. Now we find it's 2022, and there's a new generation of people of color who continue to view themselves as less than. So we have to begin to pass the baton to ensure that this legacy of self-love continues. If humanity is going to eradicate racism, we must show compassion, practice justice, and heighten our level of love for ourselves and others. So I wanted to share a little bit about some of the practices that we do, just a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I don't think I pushed share my screen first, so hold on. Screen, share. Beg you all's pardon, I'm trying to make it happen. Okay. Some of the ways that we utilize theater to be able to just share a little bit. I'm going to share this. strong unity and respect within our community. We also want to have strong feelings of respect and love for ourselves, okay? Watch. You got this. Rock your knees. Left, right, left, right, left, right. I got to love myself.
I got to love myself.
And to love myself.
And to love myself.
I got to know myself.
I got to know myself.
And to know myself.
And to know myself.
I got to see myself.
I got to see myself.
And to see myself.
And to see myself.
I got to free myself.
I got to free myself.
And to free myself.
And to free myself.
I got to be 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 myself.
Be myself.
Be myself.
I like that. Yeah, baby, I'm good. What? Yeah. I got to love myself.
I got to love myself.
And to love myself.
And to love myself.
I got to know myself.
I got to know myself.
And to know myself.
And to know myself.
I got to see myself.
I got to see myself.
And to see myself.
And to see myself.
I got to free myself.
I got to free myself.
And to free myself.
And to free myself.
I got to be 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 myself.
Be myself.
Be myself.
That was yeah, so this piece was really about the more our young people are learning to love themselves, we're utilizing our own culture, our own rituals. You heard the drum, there was movement, because this is a way in which we learn, and we're saying things that help our young people to be able to love themselves. So they're learning African songs and African stories and learning about history in a way. You know, they may say, Harriet Tubman didn't take no stuff, wasn't scared of nothing either. She didn't come in this world to be no slave and wasn't gonna stay one either, and didn't stay one either. That's a poem by Eloise Greenfield. We want to remember, so our way of dealing with racism in the realm of theater is to be able to tell those true stories, to help our young people to be able to self-realize, to love themselves for who they are, and to inspire other artists. We shout from every platform, if we're painting, remind our young people to paint the faces brown and be proud. Ashe.
Thank you, Mama Rashida. Next we have Libby Doman. Libby is a K-12 art educator in Northern Virginia. She designs and delivers curriculums, workshops, and keynotes to help educators grapple with topics that are often deemed taboo. Libby has worked with schools, universities, museums, boards, and learns to help them notice inequities and disrupt the status quo. Her work focuses include, but are not limited to, race, gender, orientation, disabilities, language, socioeconomic status, and other populations. Thank you, Libby.
All right, thank you so much, Pam. Really glad to be here, especially on this panel with all of these lovely educators that I admire. My name is Libya, like the country. My last name is Doman. It sounds like Roman, but it starts with the letter D. I introduce myself in that way every time because my name is truly important. My parents took the time to find that name for me. And, you know, I think as an anti-racist educator, right, I know that names and identities and families truly matter. I do want to start off by, you know, just saying that racism is ordinary in art education, right? To hearken to connect to critical race theory, we know that racism is something that shows up in art education all the time. And it's exhausting, frankly. And I'm constantly paying attention to that when I'm teaching my students. I'm currently a middle school teacher, but for 19 years prior to that, I served as an elementary art teacher. I always tell people that I'm not anti-racist, but I'm practicing anti-racism, right? And when I teach, I always remember that there's a double track agenda, right? On one hand, I'm having students make art, and on the other hand, I'm also recognizing our humanity, right? I want them to grow up to be good humans in general, right? So I'm helping that process. There was a time when I was doing a lesson that was formally about drawing a dream home for someone, for themselves, for their families, maybe for someone who needs a place to stay. But the lesson was about so much more than like drawing on a flat surface, right? It was also about feeling empowered to envision yourself taking up space, right? The second week of the project, I was asking the class to tell me how homes are the same or different. And the kids were listing literal architectural elements like rooftops, domes, picture windows, bricks, dormers. And, a little part of me was like, okay, they got the features. And then one kid said, water bill, right? And I was a little struck. And then I said, oh, okay, well, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And she said, well, the rent, the light bill, right? And it was interesting because we ended up having this amazing conversation in part because of her brilliance, but also because I was aware that this lesson was about so much more than a drawing of a house on a sheet of paper, right? Staying grounded in that idea that I have a double track agenda allows us to dig below the surface. And I model that willingness when I share things about myself with my students. That cultural iceberg is an activity that I have done with adults, but I've also done that with students. I've scaffolded 5th grade through 8th grade. And I think, I could probably go to 3rd grade as long as I thought about the way that I would scaffold it for them, right? But I really want them to kind of think about like, there are things we can see and there are things that we can't see about you. And all of those things truly are important. I think that as an art educator and considering anti-racism, it's really important to pay attention to our teaching practices. And I often kind of think of this positionality that Ibram X. Kendi talked about, thinking about like, you're either working toward anti-racism or you're not, and I hate to, to even say that because we don't exist in the binary world, but there's a certain level of truth to it. We can be in this place of like segregationists, where we're trying to separate folks and we're blaming folks for the bias that they experience. We can be an assimilationist place, which is a space where we think, if you just really work hard, and you try to meet the norms of a lot of institutions, then you'll be fine. I think I spend a lot of time in that space when I think about my education and how my parents pushed me in education, and also anti-racism, right? To being anti-racist. And that is, we're thinking about the system and addressing the system to make some of those changes, right? But in art education, there are some ways that we can like help ourselves move toward anti-racism by really kind of paying attention to possible over-reliance on white European male artists, right? That occurs a lot of the time. We might think about this idea of cultural appropriation, right? And I always say, I think cultural appropriation is really complex, but a simple way of thinking about it is that we learn as toddlers that there's a difference between taking and sharing. And cultural appropriation is basically taking parts of culture that's not your own and using it to serve your own personal interests, which can run counter to the original purpose, right? And often this is done without consent. And just really kind of pushing ourselves past this place of like taking, but appreciating, sharing knowledge, and certainly uplifting the voices of the people that objects and art and artifacts and music and dance belong to. Shout out to Mama Rashida for the wonderful music. But also kind of thinking about like when we are doing lesson plans, or if you're in the K-12 arena, thinking about this idea of like, are we like having this really narrow focus on like the formal qualities of what we see there? Are we trivializing like the deeper meaning of art? Do we have any humility to basically say, you know what, this is not mine. This is not mine to touch. It's not mine to try and have people make art about it. Are we being reductive at times? Are we talking about Africa, the continent? Can we bring that to a place of thinking about the country, the region, a town, people, a tribe, a language, religion? Really complex. Most things like math are really quite complex, right? So we really want to really pay attention to what we're teaching, how we're teaching, and does this promote anti-racism in the process? So kids talk to me about issues related to diversity frequently. And one of the reasons they do that is because I openly talk about issues of diversity with adults and kids on a regular basis. So I have a lot of practice. And in some school settings, I am one of the few African-American women that they encounter. So for those students, I embody issues of race. I also taught for quite a few years, about 5 years at George Mason University in their Masters of Art teaching program. And for many of those art education students, those graduate students, I was the only professor of color that those students encountered, in their years in the school. So one of my biggest jobs as an educator is not to inadvertently tell a student that talking about race or gender or any number of topics is taboo. I want to normalize talking about issues of diversity. And I don't want to signal that something is untouchable that something is untouchable. And usually that means that, my response is open. Sometimes that means my response is, I emote and show that I have feelings about things, right? That I can talk about things and say, well, that's great. Or I can also talk about things and say that hurts me, right? And hurts me as a human, hurts me as a Black woman. And, in education, a lot of times you hear people say things like, oh, we don't talk about that here, right? Of course, there are some topics that we probably need to pull parents into or guardians. We need to pull in a counselor, perhaps. But there are a lot of things that we can actually engage in with our students. My previous school was largely Central American families, and my kids would say Black in a whisper. They literally would come close to me and whisper Black, right? And somewhere they had learned that Blackness was such a problem that it was not to be named. So, one of the things that I was really clear about is that when I was going to draw a self-portrait and I was going to go and select a brown, I am just so deliberate in talking about the delicious milk brown chocolate of my skin. And most of my students, especially the younger ones, they want to get their hands on that chocolate brown, right? And what I'm doing in describing my skin and my hair and the way that I am as worthy and beautiful and worthy of being praised, I am actually countering a narrative of anti-Black racism, right? The materials that we use are super important, right? We want to make sure we're not always giving them white paper, right? We want to give them some brown paper, we want to give them some tan paper, we want to give them peach papers, right? We want to think about the kinds of crayons that we're using, the types of paint that we're using, because these things matter. You know, if you are an educator out there, do your kids know how to mix the colors of their skin in paint, right? I have had teachers say to me, how do you draw Black hair, right? And again, I think that kind of thinking it's important for people to voice it, but we need to expand it by saying, like, you know, we draw Black hair like you would draw water. You would observe it closely, you would contemplate the nuances, and you would practice doing that thing. You know, there's so much about, you know, Black people, our beauty, our intelligence, our resourcefulness, our history, our humanity, all of these things I bring into the classroom on a regular basis. And so my kids get an opportunity whenever they see me to counter anti-Black racism by enjoying and loving and being with me on a regular basis. And I definitely enjoy and love being with them. But the reality is that, you know, racism benefits some, right? So there's often little incentive to end it. It's ongoing. And, you know, it's important for us to figure out ways to talk about it. And one of the ways that I have helped other teachers really talk about issues and race is by using some standards that are put out by this organization called Learning for Justice. They have social justice standards. And they really kind of help me think in a more formal way about concepts to touch and reinforce, such as diversity, identity, justice, and action. And I really love sharing them with other people because they are broken down by grade levels. So wherever you are, you know, there is like a process to go through using these standards. Pam asked us to kind of share some stories of anti-racist teaching. And I think I kind of have shared a couple of things already, but I just want to say that showing up as an educator in some spaces for art education are really tough. This picture that you see on the screen is from a few years ago, my state art education conference. I think Pam and Gloria were both there at that time. And they had this display, and the display was basically fun headpieces. And I mean, for me, you know, just looking at this picture, there are so many issues on this table, right? And I think that something about showing up as a Black educator, a Black art educator, is that I'm always looking at the images, I'm always paying attention to the nuances, and I'm always showing up with this awareness, this intelligence that so many people around me don't seem to have, right? You know, and so when you run to that afro and you make a joke about it, and that's exactly what my hair looks like, right? You are not really welcoming me into the space. I feel that it's my obligation to kind of talk about these things so that others can make some type of change. But I've actually gotten to my 10 minutes, and I just want to say, if you would like to connect with me, my email is on the screen. I'm also available on Instagram, and glad to be here.
Thank you, Libya. Okay, so next up we have Dr. Gloria J. Wilson, founding co-editor of Racial Justice Studio, co-editor of forthcoming anthology, A Love Letter to This Bridge Called My Back, and assistant professor of art and visual culture education at the University of Arizona. She's a practicing artist and facilitator for anti-racism workshops in museums and community spaces, utilizing art-based methodologies. Her research broadly examines notions of power, access, representation, and refusal across arts modalities, and specifically examines the intersections of identity and arts participation. Welcome, Gloria.
Thank you, Pam. And hi, everyone. It's so good to be with everyone. I'm here in Arizona. Yesterday and the day before it was in the 90s, and today I think it's in the 60s. And so again, I'm glad to be here with you all today. Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right, are you all able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank you, Pam, for inviting me to have this conversation alongside these dynamic artists and educators. And I'll start by saying that when Pam invited me to have this conversation, she requested that I talk a bit about my work with Racial Justice Studio here at the University of Arizona. And so today I'm speaking as one of the 3 founding co-directors of Racial Justice Studio. And I believe that the strength of Racial Justice Studio resides in the specificity of each of the co-directors' separate but interconnected interest in facets of justice in and through the arts and education. And I'll begin by addressing how my work in centering Blackness is pivotal to anti-racist teaching, and then follow by discussing a bit more about Racial Justice Studio, its foundational pillars of engagement, and a course that was developed and implemented in the fall of 2021. In engaging in this endeavor and my own personal work, I have been inspired by many Black women creatives, including Christina Sharp, Sadia Hartman, Dion Brand, M. Norbezi Phillip, who all center narratives of Black social life. And I'm reminded of an interview that artist Alicia Walters gave to New York Times in June of 2020. And that was right at the beginning of the pandemic and right, at the height of what we all witnessed in the murder of George Floyd. And a particular quote in the interview struck me as foundational in doing the work of anti-racist teaching as it relates to anti-Blackness. Ms. Walters noted that white supremacy, quote, white supremacy, which has harmed everyone, including robbing white people of their own humanity, needs anti-Blackness to thrive, end quote. Centering Blackness, and I'll argue at the intersections of race and gender, removes both the fuel and the constraints of white supremacy, allowing everyone to be free of its tyranny. Doing so acknowledges the historical root of this racial hierarchy that has intentionally placed Black people at the bottom of society and gives us the opportunity to see the world through the lens of the Black experience. It requires us to imagine how our rules and structures would be reorganized and envision a world where we all thrive because the bottom is removed. When we remove Blackness from the bottom, everyone gets to be seen, end quote. In sum, I believe we must consider centering intersectional Blackness. And this also reminds me of Audre Lorde's words, "Until Black women are free, none of us will be free." The arts have always played a pivotal role in bringing awareness to social issues, including issues of race and racism. And I appreciated Mama Rashida's words, and quote, "The arts are a powerful tool," end quote. So artists as thinkers have always challenged the greater public to think differently about our world. And what comes to mind are filmmakers, musicians, those in the acting community, and visual artists whose works provoke us with aesthetic languages, the affective ways that systems of injustice work to produce, reproduce, or ameliorate deep suffering in people's lives due to racial violences of all kinds. When thinking about these issues, I, along with the co-directors of Racial Justice Studio, wanted to activate arts vocabularies. We all agreed that studios, in particular, are relevant to all arts disciplines. They are spaces of risk-taking, trying new things, and reflection in action. Racial justice is at the heart of the particular studio here at the University of Arizona, in that it promotes deep understanding of racism and anti-racism, centering on creative practice. So what you see here on the slide are the 5 principles for engagement that support the work of Racial Justice Studio as pillars. We see these as foundational and a place to begin thinking about the relationship between the arts and white supremacy rooted in anti-Blackness. These are not simply talking points. And I love that quote that Libby showed us on her slide. Reading about anti-racism doesn't make you anti-racist. And so again, these pillars are not simply talking points. They should be seen as a part of our daily lives. And I think that, you know, I echo the sentiments of both Mama Rashida and Libby Doman in saying that and putting that forward. They should be a part of our way of being. We should normalize it as our way of knowing, and we should apply this to our teaching and learning. As I mentioned before, in the fall of 2021, I, along with Amy Cray, who is also a panelist here today, co-designed and co-taught a course titled Rehearsals in Anti-Racism. This course was designed to engage students in personal, political, philosophical, and aesthetic conversations about race, racism, and their intersections with other markers of identity. We used a workshop-style teaching method to engage all the senses in arts-based creative activities and conversations about race, which then moved beyond words to something more embodied and participatory. And as you can see here in these photos, students were tracing each other's bodies while also thinking with a previous exercise of mapping their positionalities. This was completed after creating a portrait identity chart by asking themselves the question, who am I? While also considering which labels on their chart represented how they saw themselves and which one represented how others saw them. Themes addressed in the course throughout the semester included othering and belonging, bodies in space, surveillance and policing, well-being and trauma, social media and truth, and more. Students learned how systemic racism affects their own histories, perceptions, and relationships, as well as how to creatively intervene in a world structured by racial inequality. The overall goals of the course were to have students develop critical and embodied awareness of systemic racism and how it affects their lives, and also to build inter and intra-racial relationships and compassion for those who are the target of racial violence, including microaggressions. It was important to us that we develop a student-centered program, which activated not only their intellect, but also their imagination, their senses, and their symbolic sense-making systems. We accomplished this by using 360 video capture as an experimental artistic mode of engagement that exploited the affective and embodied qualities that are intrinsic to the arts. Here you see a screen capture of a completed final project titled Micro for Who? I don't know why I trip over this word, mundanity of everyday life. I want to add extra syllables to this word all the time. This group project gives a 1-minute glimpse of an actual occurrence experienced by a student in the course. In her final paper, she writes, I left the South Recreation Center on campus. Along the way back home, a silver pickup truck drove by with its windows down and loud monkey calls came from its interior. It then sped around the corner and out of sight. I was the only person on the road in these early morning hours. And so being the lone receiver of this heavily racial offense, I stood there perplexed, looking around in utter disbelief that this happened in Tucson of all places. I've spent more than half of my life in the South and have never had something so overtly racist happen to me. I never imagined moving to the Southwest would put me in harm's way, as that moment proved it would. The student would also reveal that the group working on the group project was hesitant to recreate this recent personal crime, as the student quoted, that it would turn out to be a part of a necessary healing process for her. And so overall, the outcomes of the course, Rehearsals in Anti-Racism, would be that students develop knowledge of racism through creative practice, and that they would build connections, compassion, and co-conspiratorship among themselves, with faculty, departments, other initiatives on campus, centers, and institutes within and beyond Arizona Arts, who all might share a commitment to anti-racism. And I'll leave you today with just a few resources that inspired our course building that we also shared with students in our course. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Okay, so next up we have Gloria's colleague, Dr. Amy Cray, Associate Professor in the School of Art at the University of Arizona. She's also the Associate Vice President for Equity in the Arts and co-founder and co-director of Racial Justice Studio, along with Gloria, which is a transdisciplinary incubator for the study and practice of intersectional anti-racism in and through the arts. Amy's research focuses on how the arts and art education can challenge as well as reinforce systems of inequality. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Pam. I'm delighted to be here, and I am going to move straight into sharing my slides. So bear with me. So I want to talk today about what building a foundation for anti-racist art education, which is necessarily also an artist education, what that might look like. To provide some context, I am at the University of Arizona, and this institution, like the other institutions of higher learning where I've taught, is a historically white institution. Even though the student body is increasingly non-white, historically and within its structures, it is a white institution. And since the age of probably 11 or 12, my own studies have primarily been in similar institutions. And I was really struck by what Libby mentioned when she talked a lot about systems, right? And like Libby, I think a lot about knowledge as a particular kind of system. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to dive right in. American journalist Isabel Wilkerson, the author of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, helps us to see that history is a necessary lens for understanding and responding to our present racial predicament. She likens colonization, slavery, and indigenous displacement as being a lot like a house that was built long ago. Here's a quote from her. She says, "We in this country are like homeowners who inherited a house. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us here was here when the house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks, bowed walls, and fissures in the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours, and we must now deal with them, because any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands." End quote. Cosmetic remedies like paint and plaster will do nothing to address the fundamental problems that Wilkerson describes. So what must be addressed are the structures, the systems upon which the house rests. And so what are the necessary building blocks, if you will, for an anti-racist art education? To address this question, my collaborator, one of my collaborators, Joni Boyd Acuff, and I wrote a book. The book is titled Race and Art Education. It's a resource that came out in summer of 2021 from Davis Publications. In it, we draw inspiration from the pedagogical brilliance of Black feminist education scholars, Joyce King, Tamara Beaubouf LaFontaine, Bell Hooks, Bettina Love, Gloria Ladson-Billings, and many, many others. The first building block that I want to share today is growing comfortable and competent with racial dialogue. Libby talked about this earlier. Growing comfortable in any situation is most likely to occur when we feel we understand what's expected. So racial dialogues are situations that can be designed or they can emerge spontaneously, but for them to be successful, it is helpful to be explicit about our expectations and to spend time developing rules of engagement or community agreements. This is especially important when racial dialogues include people who are early in developing racial awareness. We have rules for engagement that fall into two broad categories. We have some do's, like do be curious, be humble, be real or authentic, and be vulnerable. But we also have some don'ts, right? The don'ts are things that are not particularly constructive, getting stuck, right? Particularly stuck in feelings of guilt or resentment, complacency, decentering, and in this point, we refer to decentering race and racism, which can and does happen often with folks who are not practiced in talking about race, and conflating, in particular, conflating white identity with whiteness. White identity being an identity that some people have come to ascribe to, and whiteness being an ideology that's roughly the same as white supremacy. Those are two separate things that should not be conflated. Another foundational building block is understanding the socio-historical context through which race was and still is constructed by human beings. While most here may understand or at least have heard many times before that race is a social construction. Not many realize, at least not at the level of consciousness necessary, that because it is a social construction, it has the potential to be revised and adapted for the benefit of those it is intended to support most. So in my classes, we look at things like redlining maps, right? We use these visual artifacts to think about socio-historical construction of race. We dive into the US Census using this interactive timeline that dates back to the 1700s. This particular tool enables learners to see the evolution, the adaptation of racial categories. The labels, which are assigned to specific bodies, correspond to their respective identification as fully human, as mattering, particularly as it relates to voting and political power, as well as the distribution of tax dollars. All things that impact access to resources like affordable and livable housing, employment opportunities, and accessibility to a good education. There are a lot of bits and pieces to this interactive. I would encourage you to check it out. It's free and available to anyone on the internet. But one thing I might emphasize is how certain categories maintain their currency over time. And the other categories are modified, adapted, elaborated in ways that serve the stability of this one category of white identity. I also like to teach students about Costas paintings. In the 1700s and 1800s, Costas paintings were a really popular genre in New Spain. New Spain was an empire that encompassed much of South America, Central America, and North America, including most of the modern day United States west of the Mississippi River and the Floridas. The Costas paintings were organized as a hierarchy, moving from left to right and top to bottom. It progresses from lighter skinned to darker skinned figures. We can see this in the image in front of us. The viewer quickly grasps that lighter skin represents a higher social plane, a higher social status, more power and privilege through its very placement on the visual plane. And the figures were arranged in this same grid format in Costas paintings, with each compartment numbered from 1 to 16 in this case. And what I use this tool to help students understand is that Costas painting, like much of art and visual culture, teaches the viewer an association between darker skin and lower position. In effect, it teaches white supremacy on the basis of anti-Blackness. Racial hierarchy based on white supremacy, and when that white supremacy is premised on anti-Blackness, is literally everywhere. Movies, illustrated books, commercial advertisements that target children frequently draw on the white supremacy or on white supremacy in their depictions. And so when I was visiting a popular family restaurant some years ago for breakfast, we were getting pancakes. My children were handed this kid's menu. I'm not sure if you see the parallels between the left image and the right image. But as an educator and as a parent, I was concerned. I was shocked, really, about what my kids would internalize from seeing the menu, where we have light and dark skin tones represented within a hierarchy, quite similar to the Costas paintings. A third building block is visual racial literacy. And this is all about enabling art students to recognize, critically interpret, and respond to visual codes, conventions, representations, and technologies that are used to prop up the myth of race and racial hierarchy. Without this capacity, without this kind of literacy, art educators, art students, and professional artists are highly susceptible to internalizing and ultimately repeating racist imagery like we see here, racist narratives, and racist aesthetic sensibilities encoded in much of art and visual culture. Here are a few examples. Right, we take the time in our practice to teach about 19th century Blackface minstrelsy and to show its connections to today. We teach about racial tropes. Here we see the repetition of racial and gender tropes, with the Black male portrayed as scary, violent, dangerous, not fully human, and the white female as innocent, vulnerable. And racial iconography like that of Sarah Bartman, who was an actual person whose likeness has endured as hypersexualized racial trope, emblematic of the white gaze. Of course, positive identity formation is paramount also to building an anti-racist art education. This means being attentive to students' social, psychological, and emotional reality. This is exactly how I'm understanding what Mama Rashida was saying when she talked about self-love and belonging. To know myself, I have to see myself. Amy Sherrill talks about the importance of seeing oneself in the development of her own artist identity. So I turn a lot to interviews with artists, Black artists and other artists of color, when they are talking about their own artist education. In an interview, she said, when I saw an image of a person of color, it all came together in that moment. That was something real, that somebody created this who was alive at the same time that I was alive. My art teacher brought me into my own work and helped me understand my own relevance. Here she's talking about when she was in elementary school. Mark Bradford brings material circumstances to light. Thinking back on his artistic development, he says this: I hate it when people tell young kids you can do anything you want without qualifying it. Economic, social, and ethnic realities play a big role in young people's choices. These realities need to be discussed almost in conjunction with their artistic aspiration. End quote. Last semester, I had the honor to teach a class with my fellow panelist, Gloria Wilson, and she showed some images from rehearsals in anti-racism that we co-taught. And here I just want to highlight that within our practice, we invite students to think about how these two aspects of identity formation, representation, which is symbolic, and economic circumstances, which is the material reality of their lives, all play into how they think of themselves as artists. So these are a few of the building blocks of my own anti-racist practice, and I appreciate you allowing me the space to share them with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. You all are all brilliant. So Chanel is going to bring it home for us. Chanel Compton is Executive Director of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and the Banneker Douglas Museum in Annapolis, Maryland. Chanel is an artist and cultural administrator with a strong belief that the process of creating art is both healing and create deep connections with others. Welcome, Chanel.
First of all, I want to thank Ms. Pamela Lawton for her invitation and all the work that she's doing to amplify community voices through art and art education. I am humbled to be here today with this phenomenal panel of women leaders in the field of arts education. I do want to give a special shout out to Mama Rashida. I used to work at Creative Alliance for a year as the education director. Before I moved on to be executive director for the Prince George's African American Museum, a really great organization. But the days that I really needed encouragement, Creative Alliance at the time was newly diversifying its staff and its board, and it was just, it was a bit taxing, And so I remember going into the youth program at Tinch Tillman Elementary School, and they would do these affirmations that Mama Rashida had presented earlier, and I would do them because I needed them personally. So it just charged me up spiritually, and I also think it kind of helped me plant the seed of, wow, like I really want to support Black cultural institutions, Black artists. And a little while later, I became the ED for the Prince George's Museum, and now I'm the executive director for the Banneker Douglas Museum and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And I have to say, I really love my job. I love what I do. And yeah, so let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Love you, Mama Rashida. And so let's see. Get rid of all this stuff around it. So just let me know if okay, hopefully you can see it. So my presentation is really a lot of storytelling. It is kind of like a holistic, or I'm going to try to make it as holistic as possible, oration of my work with the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, and how that's impacted me on an artistic level, and also the Commission's work around anti-racism in the great state of Maryland. So just FYI, so I'm the executive director for the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and the Banneker Douglas Museum. This commission was founded in 1969, and it was the first state ethnic commission in the nation, and it's the only state African American commission to operate a state's museum and an African American grant program. So I'm truly honored to work for this historic commission. The center person you'll see in the center, Senator Verda Freeman Welcome. She was really the brainchild for this commission. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about her and her legacy and what our work is today around anti-racism and racial equity. So Verda Freeman Welcome, this is when she was running for the House of Delegates. She's super fly, as you can see, with her mink coat and her signage, and she actually ran and won for Baltimore City 4th District. In 1964, she survived an assassination attempt, and we all know what legislation was passed in 1964. It was the Voting Rights Act. So she survived. She was actually shot, but she survived an assassination attempt, and she continued her work as a Maryland state legislator, becoming the first African American woman state senator in Maryland, and the second in the nation. And I mean, talk about doing the work. So a year after King's assassination, during that time after King's assassination, Verda Welcome, she worked with HBCU professors and community leaders, and she developed the concept, and this is the first of its kind, the concept for the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And the rationale was, and you can see her a little older, but still fly nonetheless, on the left-hand side. The vision was, okay, how can you really, let me just say this, she was also inspired by the Black Museum movement. So during the 60s and 70s, you had like institutions such as the Anacostia Community Museum opening, the DuSable Museum in Chicago, the Studio Museum of Harlem. So you had these institutions opening with the under the framework of authentically preserving and presenting Black history, art, and culture. Now, this is a product of the civil rights and Black power era. And so Senator Welcome was a part of that, along with her colleagues, were a part of that wave of Maryland needs something like that too. Given, you know, that the state of racial inequity, of legalized segregation. So her vision was to create a commission to start collecting and preserving African-American artifacts, artwork, that, and also making it publicly accessible to the public, was a part of her vision. So in this photo, this is a photo of the Banneker Douglas Museum, which was once Mount Moriah AME Church. The Banneker Douglas Museum is Maryland's state museum on African American history and culture, and it's in a historic preservation site. Mount Moriah Church was an AME church in Annapolis, right down the road of where Senator Welcome worked during the state legislative session. And it was going to be torn down. The county wanted to tear it down and turn it into a parking lot, but it was literally the Black epicenter in Annapolis. So Senator Welcome, along with her colleagues in the newly formed Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, picketed. They slept in sleeping bags to prevent the county from tearing it down. They went to court and they won preservation status, which prevented the county from tearing it down. But the commission already had a collection. But they needed a repository. So this is on the left is an early photo of the what was once Mount Moriah Church when it was abandoned, and now it is the State's Museum on African American History and Culture. We have our modern facility and our historic facility. It really, truly is an architectural marvel. Frederick Douglass once spoke there, Rosa Parks. And it's today the state's repository on African American heritage. And we are a part of Senator Welcome's legacy, a strong, I'm going to take away strong. She was a Black woman who understood the collective, right? It wasn't something that it was like personality driven. She knew she had to lock, which is a very woman oriented way of doing. You know, if you think of the Black Lives Matter movement, how it was founded by Black women, it's not about having a personality driven initiative. She knew that locking arms with other professors, with other community leaders, with other educators, with artists, would create an institution and create public access and resources that are needed in the state of Maryland. So this is our permanent exhibition. This was, again, the early photo you saw of Mount Moriah. Today it is an exhibition space. This exhibition here was entitled the Black Vote Mural Project, which we commissioned Black artists to create artwork that amplifies the history of the Black vote. Now, this was in 2020, which was the year of the anniversary of the women's suffrage movement. So our work around anti-racism, so this is around, of course, during the pandemic, the public lynching of George Floyd, the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. Like when we think of like anti-racism and all of these current practices, you know, Black museums have been doing this work for generations. And, you know, and that was the Black museums came out of historically Black colleges, you know, came out of civil rights leaders and educators. So this paradigm that a lot of white institutions are adopting, which is amazing, is we cannot forget that this foundation was laid by the anti-slavery movement, by Black social justice movement that made democracy even fuller for all Americans. We knew that early on that the commission, yes, we have to be true to our mission when it comes to historic preservation, but we also have to keep our pedal to the metal when it comes to advocacy and training and education around racial equity. So we formed the Anti-Racism Coalition, where we partnered with a number of organizations in Maryland to lead free anti-racism trainings. The coalition is still in existence, and we're planning a symposium, hopefully at Morgan State University, but it will be in the fall. In addition to that, we did work with the governor's office. We wrote letters. We had a lot, and we continue to have a lot of difficult conversations around racial equity, particularly when it comes to state funding to African-American heritage sites, be it museums, schoolhouses, cultural centers, and so forth. So we partnered with Maryland Historical Trust. I mean, when I say, listen, it was some courageous conversations that needed to be had. And so we partnered with other state agencies to start racial equity groups to examine their racial equity practices when it comes to state funding to African-American projects and heritage sites. So that is currently underway in partnership with Maryland Historical Trust and the Commission. In addition, we wrote letters we had to the governor, especially during COVID-19, and encouraging him to do more for Black communities around health and wellness. We currently have a bill on the floor to increase the grant for the African American Heritage Preservation Grant from $1 million a year to $5 million, because Black museums are severely underfunded in Maryland. I mean, and which is crazy because I mean, we all know what it is, what the reasoning is, but you know, African American heritage history in Maryland. I mean, this is the epicenter for Black social justice movements. You know, this is the birthplace of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. This was a huge. This was a space where the most freed African Americans lived during the history of enslavement, right here in Maryland. So there's so much history to preserve and to uplift. And so our job as a commission is to make sure that these heritage sites have the resources that they need to not only sustain, but also to thrive. We've supported over 150 heritage projects through Maryland, heritage sites throughout Maryland, but we're also looking to support new projects, new cultural centers in Maryland as well. So we're dedicated to anti-racism training, presenting and paying and supporting and providing resources to Black artists. Youth programming is at the forefront of all of our work. So we have an after-school program at Stewart Hill Elementary. We have one starting up at Eastport Community Center in Annapolis. And of course, historic preservation is a critical part of our work. The commission, along with the museum, and the commission and the museum are kind of like the same, if you think about it, like, you know, so I use it interchangeably, but they're really, I'm talking about the same thing. The commission and the museum partnered with a local public art group, Future History Now, where we advocated to county and city officials to make sure that this mural was installed in Annapolis shortly after the lynching of Breonna Taylor. So this is in the neighborhood of Parole, a historically Black neighborhood in Annapolis. And we got it painted. We helped fundraise. Future History Now, this was definitely their design, but we were the advocacy arm to make sure that this mural was installed in Annapolis. I will say that, you know, being working for a state agency is difficult. And I know that there's a lot of teachers, a lot of public school teachers out in the audience. And I just have to say, power is with the people, you know, form coalitions, be patient, but if you see something that you know is fundamentally wrong and causing harm to your students, to your Black students, if you see that there needs to be more more resources, more exposure, more opportunities for your students, speak up on it. Like, there's times within my position, there's times where it can get really, really difficult, but I'm happy that I get to work with other like-minded volunteers, commissioners. We have an amazing staff at the Banneker Douglas Museum. So even through those difficult times of pushing the pendulum forward, it's incredibly agitating and taxing, but it's also really inspiring and empowering at the same time to see what can be done if we work together as a collective and stay focused.
Now, I think we're going to have to wrap up because we want to try to give some time for questions. So can you maybe do another minute?
I'll do 30 seconds.
Okay.
Thank you, Pamela. So this is some of my studio work that I painted most recently. This was on the left-hand side is a painting I did of Angela Davis. It was actually a commission with a local boutique hotel, but I ended up not taking the commission because they wanted me to take off Abolish Prisons, which is, as a modern day abolitionist, that's what Angela Davis is, that is her work. So because of the integrity of her work, and because of the work that I do with the commission, I felt empowered to stand up and say, no. And then on the left-hand side is a piece that I did about police brutality. I had some difficult conversations with some state officials where they didn't want me to use the term police brutality, but with the commission and other state legislators, we pushed back. We used our voice publicly, and the museum definitely no longer has that problem. So I did this piece a little while ago, this push and pull between police brutality, the invisibility of the word and the term, and so forth. So I'll stop sharing.
I am so sorry. I wish we could have
No, Pam, I did not time myself. I was like, I hope Pamela stops me because I can keep going.
Each of you have just been brilliant.